On August 15, 1945, the radio sets crackled across the Japanese archipelago. In measured, archaic language, the emperor's voice announced the end of the war. In cities already hollowed by firebombing, people stood still to listen. Some wept openly. Others bowed where they stood. In the countryside, the announcement carried unevenly, distorted by distance and static, yet its meaning arrived all the same. The war, which had ordered daily life for nearly a decade, was finished. What followed was described in official histories as surrender, occupation, and reconstruction. It was framed as a clean dividing line between eras. Yet in the days that followed, the end of the war did not arrive everywhere at once, nor did it arrive in the same form for all who heard it. Along the coasts of southern Japan and across former military zones, preparations continued under older assumptions. Barracks were cleaned. Registers were checked. Supplies were counted and recounted. In certain enclosed compounds, some hastily assembled, others long established, women remained where they had been placed months or years earlier. They waited for instructions that did not come, or for visitors they assumed would arrive. The atmosphere was heavy with expectation. Even in silence, the rooms felt occupied. When the first American troops appeared, their arrival was unmistakable. Engines cut through the air. Boots struck ground with unfamiliar rhythm. Foreign voices carried across open yards. For many Japanese civilians, these sounds marked fear or humiliation, the tangible presence of defeat. For the women inside the compounds, the sounds carried a more specific meaning, shaped by long experience and enforced routine. They prepared themselves according to habits that had once been necessary for survival. Clothing was adjusted. Hair was combed. Mats were laid out. The body remembered what the mind did not need to name. The official narrative of occupation would later emphasize order and discipline. Regulations were issued. Patrols established. Zones defined. The occupying force presented itself as controlled, methodical, restrained. These descriptions would enter reports and memoirs, shaping how the transition from war to peace was remembered. But beneath that surface lay encounters that were neither recorded nor anticipated, shaped not by policy alone but by expectation, misunderstanding, and silence. In the compounds, time passed slowly. Women were told to remain available. Guards continued to stand watch, though their posture had changed. Meals were served at regular hours: thin rice, pickled vegetables, sometimes barley or millet. The clatter of bowls against wood echoed in rooms stripped of decoration. At night, insects pressed against paper screens. The women lay awake listening to footsteps that passed by without stopping. They had been trained to measure their worth by demand. Their days, once rigidly structured around arrivals and departures, now stretched without purpose. The absence of men was not immediately reassuring. It was unfamiliar and therefore unstable. Some women whispered that the Americans were observing, waiting. Others believed new rules were being prepared. A few suspected that punishment, delayed but inevitable, would follow. Publicly, the occupation was marked by ceremonies and directives. Flags were lowered and raised. Documents were signed. Photographs were taken. Newspapers reported on meetings between officials, on shortages and reforms. The language was abstract, administrative. It spoke of populations and policies, of demilitarization and democratization. It did not speak of enclosed rooms where women waited without knowing whether waiting still had meaning. The women themselves were not a uniform group. They came from different regions, different classes, different circumstances. Some had been deceived, others coerced, others sold. Many were young when they arrived, older now than they had expected to be. Their identities had been reduced to function, then suspended when that function was no longer exercised. In the quiet that followed the war's end, they were left to confront a question they had never been allowed to ask. What remained when their assigned role was ignored? American soldiers passed through the areas surrounding the compounds. They inspected facilities, spoke with local officials, occasionally glanced inside rooms prepared for them. Often they did not enter. Orders, explicit or implied, discouraged fraternization. Medical officers expressed concern over disease. Commanders emphasized discipline. For reasons that varied by unit and individual, the anticipated encounters failed to materialize. This absence produced a shock that was difficult to articulate. The women had been conditioned to endure violation, not indifference. Their bodies, long treated as instruments, were now disregarded. The psychological ground beneath them shifted, leaving no clear footing. Some experienced relief that felt suspicious, as though safety were provisional. Others felt discarded, their usefulness expired without explanation. The sensory details of this period lingered in later recollections. The sound of American laughter carried from a distance, disconnected from them. The texture of uniforms that went unworn. The smell of disinfectant applied to rooms that remained empty. These impressions accumulated without resolution, creating a tension that did not erupt but settled, dense and persistent. Observers at the time noticed little. Guards remarked on boredom. Officials noted compliance. Reports mentioned closures and transfers without elaboration. The women's reactions did not register as incidents. There were no disturbances to explain, no infractions to discipline. The lack of disruption itself became a reason for omission. Yet internally, the women grappled with a contradiction that would remain unresolved. They had been prepared for brutality and found instead a void. The end of the war, which promised transformation, delivered uncertainty instead. Their suffering had not been redeemed, nor had it been acknowledged. It had simply been rendered irrelevant. As days turned into weeks, questions accumulated without answers. Were they still required to wait? Were they free to leave? Did freedom, if it existed, mean anything after years of enforced availability? The compounds, once sites of relentless activity, now echoed with footsteps that belonged only to the women themselves. The war had ended with a voice on the radio, but for them, its conclusion was marked by something far quieter, the realization that even in peace they were not seen. In the weeks that followed the emperor's announcement, daily life inside the compounds continued according to habits formed under pressure. Bells still marked waking hours. Water was drawn at the same time each morning, buckets scraping against stone. Bedding was folded and stacked with care, even when there was no longer an inspection that required it. The women moved through these routines almost automatically, their bodies retaining a discipline that no order had yet countermanded. Meals arrived as they always had. Rice, when available, was stretched thin. Sweet potatoes appeared more often than before, sometimes boiled until they split, sometimes sliced and fried in oil that smelled faintly of smoke. Pickled radish provided sharpness against the blandness. The women ate sitting on the floor, bowls held close, listening to the familiar sounds of chewing and swallowing. Conversation was subdued. What little was spoken concerned the practical. How much food remained, whether the water tasted different, whether the guards would be replaced. The guards themselves were altered figures. Japanese men who had once enforced rules with certainty now stood with less conviction. Their uniforms were worn, their authority ambiguous. Some avoided eye contact. Others spoke too loudly, as though sound might compensate for uncertainty. They repeated instructions that had lost context. Remain inside, wait for further notice. When questioned, they offered no clarity. They too were waiting. At night, the compound settled into a different kind of stillness. Before, the hours after dark had been marked by anticipation, by footsteps approaching, by the creak of doors. Now there was only the rustle of insects and the occasional distant engine. The women lay awake on thin bedding, staring at ceilings darkened by years of smoke. Some counted breaths. Others pressed fingers into their palms, grounding themselves in sensation. Sleep came unevenly. Fragments of conversation drifted through the rooms. One woman recalled whispering to another that the Americans were rumored to be tall, with pale eyes. Another repeated something she had overheard from a guard, that the occupation forces had strict rules, that they were different from Japanese soldiers. The word different hung in the air, undefined. It carried both promise and threat. In the absence of immediate encounters, imagination filled the space. Some women rehearsed responses, preparing themselves for demands that never arrived. They adjusted their posture, corrected their speech, smoothed their hair. Others resisted this impulse, refusing to prepare, though they could not articulate why. The tension between readiness and refusal created a quiet strain that manifested in small gestures. Hands clenched too tightly, tempers flaring over trivial matters, long silences where words might once have been. Occasionally, American soldiers did appear at the compound gates. Their presence was announced by unfamiliar sounds, the crunch of boots on gravel, the murmur of English. They were accompanied by interpreters or Japanese officials. Inspections were conducted with brisk efficiency. Rooms were opened, glanced into, then closed again. The women stood or sat as instructed, their faces carefully neutral. Some soldiers avoided looking directly at them. Others looked briefly, then turned away. One woman later recalled the texture of that moment, the stiffness of her clothing, the dryness in her mouth, the way time seemed to slow as footsteps approached and then passed. She had expected contact, or at least acknowledgement. Instead, there was only a nod to an official, a note taken, a door shut. The encounter ended without incident, leaving behind a sense of incompleteness. Medical examinations followed in some locations. Doctors moved through the compounds with clipboards and stethoscopes, their manner clinical. The women were prodded and questioned, their answers translated and recorded. These procedures were familiar enough, yet the context had shifted. Once, examinations had been a prelude to continued use. Now they seemed to serve an undefined purpose. The women complied, though compliance no longer promised survival in the way it once had. The days stretched. Without arrivals to punctuate time, the women marked hours by smaller cues. The angle of light through paper screens, the changing pitch of cicadas, the cooling of rice left too long in bowls. Some began to talk more openly among themselves, sharing fragments of their past that had previously been irrelevant. A woman from Korea spoke of a river near her village. Another from Okinawa described the smell of sugarcane fields. These memories surfaced tentatively, as though testing whether the present could accommodate them. At the same time, contradictions deepened. Relief at being left untouched mingled with anxiety. The absence of violation did not immediately translate into safety. It felt provisional, dependent on decisions made elsewhere by unseen authorities. The women had lived long enough under arbitrary power to distrust silence. They waited for it to break. Observers outside the compounds perceived little of this tension. To American officers, the facilities were administrative problems to be resolved. Some recommended closure on health grounds. Others deferred decisions pending further instruction. Reports used neutral language: women housed, services discontinued, order maintained. The women appeared compliant, untroubled. Their internal disquiet left no trace on paper. Japanese civilians living nearby watched from a distance. Some were curious, others resentful. Rumors circulated that the women were being spared, that they were being protected, that they were being punished quietly. No one knew for certain. The women themselves became objects of speculation rather than subjects of experience. As weeks passed, small changes signaled an impending shift. Supplies dwindled. Guards were reassigned. Notices were posted, then removed. One morning, a group of women was told to pack their belongings. The instruction was delivered without ceremony. Where they were to go was not specified. The women gathered their few possessions, clothing issued to them, personal items acquired or preserved against odds, letters never sent. Packing forced a confrontation with material reality. What could be carried, what must be left behind. Some women folded garments carefully, others stuffed them hurriedly into sacks. A few lingered, touching walls or door frames as though imprinting memory. The compounds, once sites of relentless routine, were becoming transient spaces. Departure did not resolve the paradox that had taken hold. As they left, some women looked back, half expecting a last-minute command to return. None came. The road away from the compound was quiet, bordered by grass and debris. The sound of their footsteps felt conspicuously loud. In transit centers or temporary shelters, the women encountered new forms of waiting. They were registered, questioned, sometimes interrogated. Officials asked where they were from, whether they had families, whether they could return. Answers were often incomplete. Years of displacement had eroded certainty. Some women did not know if their homes still existed. Throughout these processes, the Americans remained largely distant figures. Their policies shaped outcomes, yet their presence was mediated through paperwork and intermediaries. The women continued to register their absence more than their actions. Even when spoken to directly, the interactions were brief, functional. In recollections recorded decades later, women struggled to articulate what this period meant to them. Many focused on sensations rather than explanations. The feeling of standing idle, the weight of unused time, the discomfort of being unneeded. One woman said she felt as though her body had been trained for a task that no longer existed, leaving her unsure how to inhabit herself. Others described a slow, internal shift. The expectation of use had structured their sense of self. When that expectation vanished, it left behind a void that was not immediately filled by freedom. Freedom required imagination, and imagination had been discouraged for too long. The women found themselves suspended between identities, neither captive nor autonomous. Japanese officials who later reflected on the period often emphasized disorder and scarcity. They spoke of the difficulty of managing populations in flux. The women appeared in these accounts as logistical challenges, their emotional states unremarked. American memoirs, when they mentioned the facilities at all, framed restraint as evidence of discipline. The absence of abuse was noted with quiet satisfaction, as though it were an achievement rather than an accident of circumstance. Yet for the women the absence carried its own weight. It forced them to reckon with the meaning of what they had endured. If their bodies were no longer desired, did that lessen what had been done to them or did it render it meaningless? The question remained unspoken, but it pressed against them in moments of stillness. In shelters and temporary housing, routines were improvised. Women took on small tasks: cleaning, cooking, tending to the sick. These activities provided structure, though they did not answer deeper uncertainties. Nights were still restless. The sound of boots, even when belonging to relief workers or police, could provoke a reflexive tension. Some women attempted to leave, returning to towns or villages. The reception varied. In some places they were met with suspicion or silence. In others they were absorbed into communities preoccupied with survival. Few asked where they had been. Fewer still wanted to know. The women learned quickly what could be said and what should remain concealed. Throughout this period, the central contradiction persisted. The end of the war had brought an end to one form of violence, but it had not brought recognition or understanding. The women's shock at being left untouched was not simply relief, it was disorientation. It exposed the extent to which their humanity had been defined by use, and how difficult it was to reclaim it in the absence of acknowledgement. As time moved forward, decisions loomed. Whether to return home or remain where they were. Whether to speak or remain silent. These choices were shaped by circumstances beyond their control, yet they were experienced as deeply personal. The women approached them cautiously, aware that each step forward carried uncertainty. The occupation continued, policies evolving, attention shifting. The women's lives unfolded in the margins of these changes. Their experiences during those first months after surrender did not fit easily into narratives of liberation or reform. They remained unresolved, suspended like the empty rooms they left behind, rooms that had once been defined by presence, then by absence and finally by forgetting. In the years that followed, the separation was rarely marked by ceremony. Women who had once lived in close proximity dispersed quietly, their paths diverging without record. Some boarded trains crowded with displaced civilians, their destinations written on scraps of paper or held only in memory. Others walked, carrying bundles tied with string, moving through landscapes altered by bombing and neglect. The compounds emptied gradually, then disappeared from official concern. Where buildings remained, they were reassigned to storage or housing. Where they did not, their absence left no visible trace. Immediate survival demanded attention. Food had to be found. Work had to be secured. Illness, untreated for years, surfaced with renewed urgency. In this practical struggle, the months following the war folded into a larger continuum of hardship. The particular strangeness of that earlier waiting, the shock of being left untouched, did not announce itself as a defining moment. It lingered instead, embedded in habit and memory, emerging unexpectedly. For some women, it surfaced in silence. They avoided crowded rooms, unsettled by spaces where nothing was demanded of them. Others found themselves alert to absence, attuned to what did not happen as much as to what did. A door left unopened. A voice that did not call out. These omissions carried a weight that was difficult to explain to those who had not lived inside systems where attention, however violent, had once been guaranteed. When memories were later spoken, they were often fragmented. Interviewers noted pauses, deflections, sudden shifts to unrelated details. A woman might describe the sound of cicadas outside a shelter, or the texture of a borrowed coat, before falling silent. Asked about the Americans, she might shrug, saying only that they passed by. The significance lay not in what was done but in what was withheld. Public memory of the occupation hardened into familiar shapes. Textbooks emphasized reform and recovery. Photographs showed orderly streets, smiling children, uniformed soldiers distributing supplies. These images conveyed reassurance, a sense of forward movement. They left little room for accounts that did not align neatly with progress. The women's experiences, suspended between harm and relief, were difficult to place within such frameworks. Within families and communities, silence often prevailed. Some women married without disclosing their past. Others remained alone, their histories folded inward. In moments of intimacy or conflict, traces of earlier conditioning surfaced. A reflexive compliance, an aversion to touch, or an acute sensitivity to being ignored. These responses were rarely recognized for what they were. They were attributed instead to temperament or fate. Officials and observers who later reflected on the period tended to emphasize restraint as a virtue of the occupying forces. They noted the absence of widespread abuse as evidence of discipline and order. In doing so, they overlooked the ambiguity of that absence for those who had been trained to expect violation. The women's shock did not fit the celebratory narrative. It suggested that damage could persist even when violence ceased, and that peace could arrive without clarity. As decades passed, some women spoke publicly for the first time. Their testimonies varied in emphasis, shaped by personal circumstance and the questions posed to them. Many focused on what had been done during the war. Fewer lingered on the early days of peace. When they did, their words often circled the same point: the confusion of being suddenly unneeded, of finding that the role imposed upon them had evaporated without acknowledgement. This moment resisted easy interpretation. It did not offer redemption, nor did it compound suffering in an obvious way. It existed as a psychological hinge, a point where expectation collapsed and meaning failed to cohere. For some women, this collapse prompted a gradual reorientation toward ordinary life. For others, it deepened a sense of dislocation that never fully receded. The physical remnants of that time continued to fade. Roads were paved over. Fields reclaimed abandoned land. New buildings rose where compounds had stood. Yet memory did not follow the same path of erasure. It persisted unevenly, resurfacing in dreams, in bodily reactions, in moments of unexpected quiet. The absence that had once unsettled them became part of a larger pattern of disappearance, of stories not told, of experiences not easily shared. In later years, historians and activists sought to recover these accounts, to place them within broader narratives of war and its aftermath. They collected testimonies, examined documents, traced movements across maps. In doing so, they confronted the limits of the archive. What could be documented was often administrative. What remained elusive were the internal reckonings, the moments when silence itself became an event. The women, now elderly, spoke of time differently. The war years compressed into a single block of memory, while the transition into peace stretched indefinitely. Some said they did not know when the war truly ended for them. Others marked its end not by the emperor's voice or the arrival of foreign troops, but by the day they realized no one was coming. This realization did not announce itself with drama. It arrived gradually through repetition. Another day without summons. Another inspection that led nowhere. Another night in which footsteps passed by. Over time, the absence became undeniable. What it meant, however, remained unresolved. In reflecting on this period, one is left not with a clear moral reckoning, but with a lingering disquiet. The women had survived a system designed to use them. When that system collapsed, it did so without explanation, leaving them to navigate a freedom that was undefined and incomplete. The shock they felt was not only at being spared further harm, but at discovering how deeply their sense of self had been shaped by expectation. The end of the war is often remembered as a moment of release, a turning of the page. For these women, it was also a moment of erasure, when the gaze that had controlled their lives withdrew without recognition. They stepped into a world that no longer required them to wait, yet offered little guidance on how to move forward. What remains, decades later, is an image that resists closure. Rooms prepared and left unused, bodies trained for endurance standing idle, a silence that did not signify peace so much as uncertainty. In that silence, the question endures, not of what was taken but of what it meant to be seen at last by no one at all.